Good evening and welcome to the May webinar for 2023. I'm your host, Ian Craig. This is a very special webinar topic. I turned 50 last year, which was a big number for me, just to the point that it started changing my mindset a little bit. So as an ex-athlete who's really prized performance, I put performance on a pedestal. At this age, I'm starting to think, well, how do I retain health and fitness and maybe a bit performance moving forward to my older age? So our presenter this evening, Paul Ehren, is a good friend and colleague of mine, and he's an ex-champion masters bodybuilder. So he's lived the life of a performance athlete. But now he's retired at the ripe old age of 65. And he's starting to talk about this concept, HealthSpan, not lifespan, not getting old, whatever the cost, but getting old in a healthy way. And he's going to talk about that from the perspective of an athlete. If you're trying to retain your athletic status, at least somewhat, but healthily, what are the considerations that we need to make? So thank you, Paul. I look forward to this presentation and I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, Ian, thank you very much indeed. Welcome everyone to the seminar. As I'm recording this, it's morning, but whatever the time is in your particular part of the world, I hope that you're all fit and well. So today, yes, we're talking about HealthSpan. Now, I want to go through various phases of this. I want to actually define what we're speaking about. I want to move on what we can do, how I think we are absolutely perfectly placed within CISN to actually help people. And I want to start off with athletes, but then as I move the thing forward, I also want to look at non-athletes as well, because as we're talking about aging, then we're going to be talking about people in their 40s and 50s, 60s, 70s, and hopefully well beyond that. So everything that we're going to be talking about will apply in the long term to non-athletes as well. So I don't think it matters whether you coach elite athletes, whether you've never coached elite athletes, and they're all of a non-athletic population. With various tweaks, I think this is going to apply to absolutely everyone. So let's just start to move forward, and we're going to be doing this by a somewhat circular route. We're going to be going via some ancient Greeks and some dead rock stars, and hopefully some good science to actually bring us not necessarily to any conclusions, but at least to know the answers, or rather the questions that we need to ask. And it's that search for the answers that I find the real fascinating thing about all of this. So let's have a look at some definitions first of all. So we've got lifespan. Now that's, as I've got here, that's pretty binary. You're either alive or you're dead. So I don't think there's sort of too much question about that. HealthSpan, however, then starts to become very much more nuanced, and nuanced is a word I'm probably going to be using quite a lot during the course of this presentation. So it's not how well, or sorry, it is how well, let's get it right. It's not how long you live. But then again, it's a combination of the two. So one without the other. So a long lifespan with poor health is absolutely not the greatest idea that we could have. None of us, I don't think, want to live until we're 100, but have the last 20 or 30 years of that in some horrible disease state, which tends to be the way that things are moving forward as we are. People are living longer, without a doubt, but they're also living poorly longer. But the opposite of that, a short lifespan with good health, I would suggest is not ideal either. So as we can look at this in a sort of like a couple of different ways. There's a Greek myth about a guy called Dionysus, and he asked Zeus to provide him with eternal life, which Zeus did, but unfortunately Dionysus forgot to ask for everlasting health. So he aged and got sicker, but lived, which has got to be probably one of the worst curses that you could ever have bestowed upon you. So not really a great idea. The other side of that would be, and we'll come on to a couple of quotes in a minute, but there's a famous club or infamous club called the 27 Club, which some of you may have heard. And it's about a lot of rock musicians and artists who died at the age of 27. And that includes Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison of the Doors, Janis Joplin, Brian Jones, the Rolling Stones, Kurt Cobain, Robert Johnson, the old blues player, Richie Edwards of the Manic Street Preachers. There's a few actors actually in there as well. So let's start picking through. So this would be my idea of how to actually go out. As you can probably tell from the picture here in the thumbnail of me, this is certainly not me, but this is certainly the way that I would like to go out. Sitting on a surfboard about the age of 120, somewhere in Maui, and suddenly being taken out by a heart attack there and then. So that would be just about perfect. But the premise that we've got here, whether sitting on a surfboard at 120 is actually realistic or not, I suppose is another thing. But the premise that we've got here, the idea is to die young as late as possible. That just about sums it up. That is HealthSpan absolutely in a nutshell. The other side of that, I don't actually know whether James Dean said this. It was attributed to him, but this fits in perfectly with the 27 club. So live fast, die young, and have a good looking corpse. Well, that may work for some people, but as Ian said in the introduction, since I'm now 65, that's not exactly the way that my mind is working. So you could also look at this, not this particular quote, but you could look at HealthSpan as biological age as opposed to chronological age. We all know what our chronological age is. That's the number on the birth certificate and the current year. But what our biomarkers actually show, and I'm a great believer in actually getting biomarkers for clients, so we can actually really chew down into the meat and potatoes of what is actually going on. What is your blood pressure? What is your lipid profile? What is all of the various, what's your liver health? What's your kidney health? Without knowing what's actually going on, it's very difficult to actually do something about it. So what we've got is, and I've made a note here, we've got a very complex, non-linear, multivariate optimization problem. It's a very nerdy way of saying it's going to be difficult. So having hopefully defined what we're talking about, let's try and move this forward. So to put this a little bit more into context, this is yours truly. Now, my competition profile was strange, to say the least, in as much as I never started competing as a bodybuilder until I was 40. I really achieved everything that I did in the main while I was over 50. And even during my 50s, I still considered myself Superman. Retired in my early 60s. It was really COVID that really brought on retirement. I didn't have it, but obviously the world shut down. But it was time. various injuries and a number of other things, it really was time to retire. But I don't think it matters when your athletic career was, but certainly with mine, when I first started to compete, and that was about the same time as well that I first started to become really involved in coaching and the medicine side of things and everything else. But I was much more involved with performance rather than health. As my career actually went on, I realised how important health was, even from a performance point of view. And then obviously now we've come out the other side, it becomes extremely important for everything that's actually going on for my own longevity. Now, as we will touch on, if you've done any sport at elite level, there are consequences. So I'd like to touch wood. I'd like to think that I am pretty healthy. My shoulders, however, are absolutely shot to pieces, which is something to do with lifting dumbbells like that over a period of 40 odd years. And every sport I know done at elite level carries consequences with it. A very good friend of mine used to be a high-level triathlete. She's now looking at a hip replacement. So these are just two things, relatively minor, but two things that we need to take into account. And we're going to explore this much more in depth. Now, this comes from an article that I did for Ian a few years ago now for the CISN magazine. And I was talking about aging athletes and the things that we need to address as people get older. And again, this was more sort of performance based, but there's a huge crossover here between performance and also our longevity. And we'll come on to some research later on, which really mirrors an awful lot of this, where they talk about hallmarks of aging. But just to go through this very, very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time because this lecture will go on for something like 3 hours otherwise. So I just want to touch on various things here. The endocrine response, absolutely. You know, everything is going to start to decrease as you start to get older. Thyroid is obviously going to have a major effect on our metabolism, sex hormones. Everything starts to go down. Everything is going to start to go south one way or another. Some things are going to go up, insulin resistance sort of being one of them. And while we're on, a question that was thrown at me the other day is the differences on everything that we're talking about here between the sexes. Now, yet there are obvious differences there, and the big thing that you girls have actually got to put up with as you start to get older is obviously menopause. But it's such an individual thing. I know that my wife, for argument's sake, pretty much breezed through it. A few of the other very good friends, female friends that I've got, have really gone through a bad time. So it's very hard to lay down hard and fast rules for menopause. So I think everything that we're speaking about is going to apply to both sexes with provisos. And this really comes down to how you deal with your client, how you deal with yourself, if it is yourself that you're actually speaking about. Inflammatory markers, yeah, absolutely. Inflammation is going to go up as we start to get older. Inflammation, a really, really interesting thing. I was sharing something with Ian just before we came on about some research I was listening to. And part of it gave ibuprofen to a control group of young female resistance trainers. And the ones taking the ibuprofen as opposed to the placebo actually gained less muscle tissue because they were damping down inflammation. And obviously, a small amount of inflammation, almost a hormesis effect, is what drives to a large degree hypertrophy. But by the same token, they did the same experiment with a group of older athletes, and they didn't define what older actually was. And they found there that the group with the ibuprofen actually had more muscle tissue by the end of it rather than less. So presumably where they had much more systemic inflammation, the ibuprofen brought everything down to a sort of sweet spot where the inflammation, the acute inflammation that they were getting through the hypertrophy training actually proved to be a benefit. Interesting, really interesting. Nutrition and hydration, yeah, absolutely. Things change. I've noticed it on my parents with regards to hydration. You have to watch so carefully their fluid intake. And that's what they try and do in hospital. And as I've got down here, the number of urinary tract infections in care homes goes not taking in enough fluid. Tastes change. You will find with older athletes, and again, I'm looking at my parents, not that they were athletes at the ages when they died, but becomes quite important. You've got to bear that in mind when you're constructing diets. Genetics, yeah, that is always going to sort of fluctuate around more the epigenetics on how those genes are actually expressed rather than the genes themselves. Obviously, genes are not going to vary as far as I'm aware, but certainly how they are expressed may well be. Gut integrity, yep, we're all pretty much up to speed, I think, on gut permeability and how age can be a factor there. I would also add to that, in actual fact, don't only think of the gut when we're talking about that, but think of the brain-blood barrier and whether the same is happening there. And again, we're not just talking athletes, we're talking normal human beings here. Are we getting things into the brain that shouldn't actually be there? Is that barrier breaking down? Could that be one of the starting points for dementia? It's interesting. Neural degeneration, yeah, without a doubt, obviously we slow down mind-muscle connection. The way that nerves innervate muscle fibers is going to change. And also, again, outside of athletes, you are going to have that real neural dysfunction. So something again to bear in mind. Again, a lot of your older athletes may possibly have medical conditions and be taking pharmaceutical interventions. So that is something 100% you need to take account of. And the mental aspects, it's as you get older, attitudes change, priorities change, everything changes. You're not the same person at 40 as you were when you were 20. So very, very much worth bearing in mind. Okay, here's a very, very simplistic Venn diagram. Showing, I think, the things that we need to bear in mind. So this is where we're trying to balance everything. So we're trying to balance the performance and fitness side of it with health. Now, it's fairly easy to apply when you're looking at an athlete. Is the only thing that you're concentrating on is getting them to run 100 meters as quickly as possible. It's the only thing to win the next boxing bout. It's the only thing to win the next bodybuilding competition. Or are you taking health into account as well? But bear in mind, again, if you're not looking after athletes, performance carries across in all areas. We could be talking about someone's business. Now, I've got clients, very, very good business people who work extremely hard at what they do. And again, this balance between their performance, in this case, property business, financial services, etc., is the all-consuming passion. I suppose you could say money is the all-consuming passion, but how much are they sacrificing health and or fitness to actually get there? And I think these are the questions that we've got to start asking ourselves. If you are coaching athletes, particularly elite athletes, are you compromising your athletes' future health? Is this a conversation that you've had with your athletes? It is difficult. A 20-year-old footballer doesn't want anything else, or a 15-year-old footballer wants nothing else. He'd probably go into the road and play with the traffic if he could actually secure himself a pro contract with one of the big clubs. Is it worth taking a step back and actually looking at your athlete's health overall now, and more particularly in the future? Bear in mind, when we're talking the future, it's probably going to be a future when you two are part of your company, you're nothing whatsoever to do with that athlete anymore. But what path are we putting them on? What role model are we giving them for their future health? And as I mentioned before, everything comes with consequences. Been very much in the news recently that footballers and dementia, more to do with the footballers of a bygone age, big, heavy leather footballs, probably weigh something like 100 weight when they get wet and got a bit of mud on them. And there's a lot of dementia cases actually coming now. It's been in the news quite recently, a number of rugby players with motor neuron disease. And we've got to be careful here and try and strike the line between correlation and causation. And again, this is another massive subject that we could get into, but let's move it forward. The reason I've put Daniel Hamlin in is that it's only happened. It actually occurred when I was putting these slides together. Mr. Hamlin plays for an top-line American football side. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, to be honest. And he was tackled on the field of play. And the opponent's helmet caught him full square in the chest. Now, even with all of the padding, it caught him at just that precise moment, the cardiac cycle, to throw him into arrhythmia. And they thought at one point he was going to die. I think he's actually back and training. I think he's had a full return to health. So, tremendous. And there have been footballers in this country who have gone over on the pitch, not with the same problem, but similar. The Aussie rules, this is not going to mean very much to a lot of you, but I've got a very good friend who recently went back to Australia after a 20-year absence, and he caught up with a lot of his old Aussie rules football guys who he used to play with. And he was absolutely shocked at the amount of ill health and deaths that there had actually been there. Now, once again, could you relate that back purely to Aussie rules? Yes, so many things. There were ethnic components. Some of the guys were Aborigines, and it's been well documented that from a social deprivation point of view, from an economic point of view, these guys tend to do very badly. So how much of that could have been put down to their sport? And again, we're into correlation and causation. Combat sport, I think, is a little bit more cut and dried. Getting punched in the head a lot is not going to be good for your brain health. So you've only got to speak. Again, I've looked after fighters. I'm surrounded by a number of fighters where I train. And some of them, you can hear it. You've only got to speak to them for a couple of minutes. And they're not in a great place. Now, on some ways, I'm sort of pulling on your moral heartstrings here. But in others, there is perhaps a good reason for mentioning all of this. And that comes down to this. To the very, very best of my knowledge, there's not been a coach who has actually been sued, or there hasn't been any suggestion of a coach being sued because of problems that have occurred. It's always been the governing bodies that have actually come under fire. And there has been quite a lot of this recently. I know the rugby authorities, and I know rugby has made quite a few changes with regard to their tackling laws, for example. Football, I think, I'm not absolutely certain, but have they made changes with regard to the heading of the ball for juniors? I know there was talk of it, I can't remember. But from a very, very practical point of view, I would just say be aware, because we live in a very litigious society, and it is just possible that if you're seen to be willfully not looking after the interests of your client, it's a possibility. I hate to see it get to this, but it is a possibility. So now we're still talking about athletes here, but we're starting to move away a little bit actually from it as well. So I think this first one is absolutely huge: retirement planning. What are we doing for our clients who are coming up to retirement from their particular sport? I know Ian's got stories on this. I was lucky. The only thing that really changed with me was I stopped competing. I'm still training. I'm still seeing the same guys down at the gym. I'm still involved in the banter that actually goes on. I'm still doing a lot of the dietary things that I was, albeit not in quite the same way. So my transition has been lucky. I think for other people, and I know Ian found it hard, that not being in the locker room all the time, not being involved in the races, you're suddenly on the outside. And I would suggest, particularly if that retirement is enforced. So if you've got a 22-year-old footballer who breaks his leg badly, from going, if we're looking at a Premier League footballer, from going from having your name screamed by 50 or 60,000 people every week to nothing, must be absolutely horrendous. So again, if you have got a client coming up to retirement, worth thinking about, and it's worth getting them to plan. It's a conversation I had when I was working in financial services many, many years ago, and I was looking after some of the footballers. It was some of the questions that we asked them, and very, very few had any idea at all what they were going to do after sport. And then this moved us on, so we're now getting into the transition between athletes, ex-athletes and non-athletes. So we're looking at people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, hopefully right the way through many decades actually after that. And my question to you now becomes, how do we apply our skills to achieve this optimum health span for our clients, whether they're athletes or whether they're non-athletes? And I'm going to return to this, but I would suggest that everyone within and connected with CISN is absolutely ideally placed to push your skills forward and really, really help people. This comes with a but. I know we're a nutritional organisation, but the number of people, I know Ian's one of them, who actually came through a personal training, and I'm certainly another, came through a personal training, strength training background to get where we are now. And it's these different modalities which are actually going to get you to, I think, where you need to be. If you're only concentrating on your client's nutrition, but you're not concentrating at all on their strength and conditioning, I think you are hugely missing the trick. You're not doing your client any favours at all. And again, we'll come on to this. The life skills thing, I think this is something you get as you mature as a coach. You learn life skills. Always makes me smile when I see 20-year-old life coaches on Instagram. You've had no life. So again, this mix and match of modalities that we've got within the organisation. And I think we can do so much to push, whether it's for athletes or whether it's people outside, and we're looking at longevity generally. We've got so much here, every single one of you has got so much to actually push this thing forward. Now, this is a paper that I mentioned before, which is quite a well-known paper from 2013. And they're looking, as you can see, at what they call hallmarks of aging. People have debated what aging is for absolute decades, if not centuries. And this fine bunch of scientists tried to distill it down. And they actually came up with 9 different things. Again, very arguable, but there's a good number of them which actually cross over to the points that I was making before on the article that I wrote. They obviously do it in much more scientific terms, but there's quite a big crossover to the various things I was talking about. And here, extracted from that paper, are the 9 hallmarks. So you can read through these yourself. But if you remember what I was saying, there's a lot there to actually pick up from the various bits and bobs that I was talking about. Even though they obviously take a huge, deeper dive into these various things. So telomere attrition, dysfunction of the mitochondria, senescence, hugely complicated, hugely involved. But there are things that we can actually do and help. And it's funny, I've seen, again, we'll come on to it, there's a number of papers out there to actually say that one of the best things you can do to address these, as well as a lot of other areas for your clients, and again, we're talking more here than non-athletes, is exercise. You can make so much difference. Right, we're going to start digging somewhat deeper. So this is really on the premise that some of the things that we may be doing as athletes might not be serving us the best in the long term for longevity. Now, I've picked 3 cellular pathways here. I suppose arguably the first one you could say is most certainly an accelerator, mTOR, and the other 2 are more on the brake. AMPK is a nutriment signaling and sensing molecule. Sirtuins are enzymes which regulate function in all sorts of areas, aging, inflammation, detox, fat and glucose metabolism, mitochondria. And these are things that we're seeing, they seem to be good. We need to express these for optimum aging. mTOR is a really interesting one. There's been all sorts of research. It's really been a buzzword for a little while now on what it can actually do. Exercise is seen to stimulate it, and it's a major, major part. If you look at any good textbook, and the one by Brad Schoenfeld, The Science of Hypertrophy, most certainly pictures up. He talks a lot about cellular pathways and mTOR. And if I can just quick plug for a book that I've just started to read, if you can see that, Outlive by Dr. Attia. He takes a really deep dive into mTOR. It's a really fascinating subject. But to hit on it quickly, here's one side of the story. So, as you can see, deregulator for maintaining skeletal muscle mass. And again, they're not really looking here at sort of bodybuilders or athletes. They're looking more about the normal person. And just to take one sentence out of the abstract, full understanding of mTOR signaling and the maintenance of skeletal muscle mass could help to develop mTOR targeted therapeutics to prevent muscle wasting. Now that's huge. If we can use mTOR to actually help people become stronger as they get older, then as some of the other research I'll be digging up, you will see that this really makes, or potentially can make, a huge difference. As ever, there is never just one side to the story on this. There's all about nuances, that word again, and buts. And this is one of the buts. So we've got mTOR signaling in disease. And just again, take a very small section out of the abstract here. This regulated mTOR signaling has been implicated in major disease. Here we review recent findings on the role of mTOR in cancer, metabolic disorders, neurological diseases, and inflammation. So, well, I think if you saw this paper and followed this line of thinking through in isolation, then I think you would come up with a completely different thought process than what you would have had if you'd only seen the other paper. So again, we've got to look at the two sides of this, and this is where I would start to actually look at differences between acute and chronic. If you've got chronic mTOR signaling, maybe through type 2 diabetes is one that I would pick out, constant inflammation, constant insulin resistance, that potentially is one thing. If you've got acute mTOR signaling, like resistance training 3-4 times a week, is that something entirely different? Point that Ian made to me a little while ago is that protein consumption has been shown to have a difference on mTOR signaling. Now, if you're doing this every day, you're upping your protein every day, is that suddenly classed as chronic movement of mTOR? But then on the other side of that, as we get older, we deal with protein in a different way, as some of the previous slides have shown. So the theory there is we need more protein as we get older, particularly more leucine as we get older, to achieve the same hypertrophy effects. So again, no answers, just questions, but dig into this. I really do find this to be an absolutely fascinating thing. And these are the four, again, as we get older, these are what, again, this is a Peter Attia phrase, the 4 horsemen of disease. Vascular, so stroke, heart disease, cancer, neurodegeneration, hyperinsulinemia. And again, we can really start sort of like digging down into these. And once more, we need to start looking at what we can do to limit these as much as possible. Now, the chances are we're all going to die with some form of vascular irregularities. What we don't want to do is die from it. Same with cancer, we're probably all going to die with some sort of mutated cells, but we don't want to die from them. There probably will be some form of neurodegeneration, but again, having seen it up close and personal, you do not want to be dying from dementia. So those are the 4 things that we need to look at. So how is science and how can we start to address these? Now, if we start to look, as I've got here, from the ridiculous to the sublime, if we go from the absolutely crazy, now this is out here, not something I would necessarily suggest, but if you're unfortunate enough to come up with one of these really nasty conditions, you too can have your body frozen down to -196 degrees C. to be reanimated at some point in the future when they've found a cure for your particular condition. We're now getting into the territory of, what was that film with Dolph Lundgren and the other guy, Universal Soldier. We're getting into that sort of territory. One thing that really made me laugh about this slide was the last one. As at 2016, they were quoting a cost of $28,000 with a one-off membership fee of $1,200. Now, I don't know if that means that you can actually get a family discount. If you pay your one-off membership fee, you can have all members of your family frozen for somewhat less. But anyway, it's out there. Now, this is something that is definitely out there, not something that me and you are likely to get involved with anytime soon. This is something that you may well have heard of. Parabiosis. They've been stitching together rodents for some considerable time now. And they found that, well, they did it with a younger mouse and an older mouse. The older mouse got huge benefits from sharing the circulatory system with the younger mouse. So this research has now been going on for some little while. And obviously the question is it the blood? Is it a component factor of the blood? Looking a bit wider, could this possibly be the where it comes from with the whole sort of like vampire myth? But it's out there and it's being used. Now, if you think that this is only happening with mice or other animals, just have a little look at this 2018 paper, and they're starting to talk about the ethics of, as it's got here, of moving from mice to men. Now, if I can find it, I'm going to read out part here. Yeah. Moving from mice to men requires careful consideration. Parabiosis actualizes well-known ethical challenges. So it's happening. There are people out there who are actually starting to do with this. Another bit here, where is it? Yeah, here we go. The first blood rejuvenation studies on humans with Alzheimer's disease has started. So, man, where that's going to lead, who knows? But it's there, it's being used. Right, let's get a little bit more realistic. This is what I've said before. We are absolutely ideally placed to actually package this. Everyone involved with CISN can really start to actually pull this forward. And these are just some of the things that I would be looking at as part of the package. Now, as your clients get older, now, even these 7 basic movement patterns would not have been used in all athletes. And I was a bodybuilder. Everything was frontal and sagittal plane. There was no rotation in bodybuilding whatsoever. So I was missing out on an awful lot. So as a basic of a strength and conditioning course to actually get your older non-athletic clients up to speed, this is one of the first places that I would actually start. And if you can start to progress things on from there, there's other things which will come on to, but this is such a great place to actually start. And this is a paper, 2017, and this sums it up very nicely about what actually sort of needs to be done and the various aspects of what we need to do, because physical inactivity is killing people. So there's a lovely sentence in here: for substantial health benefits, older athletes need to do aerobic, muscle strengthening, and stretching exercises weekly, and balance activities as needed. you can actually pull those together. If you can get your clients actually doing those, then you're just about where you need to be, together with some of the other things that we're going to come on to. Now, this takes muscle mass and strength in isolation from the others. But again, people are seeing more and more and more that this is becoming hugely important. Even the NHS is waking up to grip strength, which they tend to use as a parameter for overall strength. And I've recently been seeing, a number of you will know Pete Williams, the functional medicine guru. And I've recently been seeing a whole series of his stuff on Facebook, where he's going through some very basic strength exercises for older athletes. And there are some scary statistics out there. For argument's sake, I think it's American, but it probably translates pretty much over here. If you fall and break a hip after the age of 65, there's a 30% chance that you won't live past a year. 12 months, 30% chance of dying within a year if you break a hip. So if we can get someone in a position where they're less likely to fall through exercise, through strength, we're putting ourselves in a very good place. Now, obviously, we're also going to have to take into account nutrition. And to a large extent, I don't get dogmatic about nutrition. You can argue keto as opposed to paleo, as opposed to high fat, low carb, high fat, carnivore. And people get in their own little tree houses and get very, very protective. And a lot of cognitive dissonance starts to actually come into it. If you can provide your client, and I'm going to use some very, very catch-all phrases here. If you can provide your client with a good, basic, well-rounded diet, cut out as much sugar as possible, as many processed, highly processed foods and takeaways as possible, you're going to take them an awful long way to where they need to be. And then a lot of it after that then comes down to what is going to promote adherence with your clients. What is the best diet for them to actually keep on? And some will love a keto approach. Some will find completely the opposite. Some will find a vegan diet really easy to adhere to. And yet there's problems with all of them. There's benefits and problems with each and every diet. I would just ask you to be very open-minded with what actually you're doing, and don't just push a particular nutritional dogma. One of the first slides that I ever saw of Ian's years ago when I first started to contact him was a complete screen made up of various shades of grey. I think he's updated this now to make it a screen full of shades of various colours. But that is facts. Things aren't black and white. Things are all shades of grey. We need to be aware of that on everything that we do for our clients, particularly with regards to exercise, particularly with regard to nutrition. I think those are the two things where people, it does get very, very dogmatic and people get very protective. Well-being. Again, I think this is so important. It was something that I never thought of when particularly when I first started competing. But this young lady actually getting out into the fresh air, getting that sunlight on her face. There's some great research about getting some sunshine in your face when you first actually wake up in the morning, and that setting or resetting the 24-hour clock within our bodies. Getting out into the fresh air, getting out into nature. We're not separate from nature. We can have the biggest effect on it than everything, but we are nature. We screw with it to our own peril. And as much as you can interact with that, I'm lucky enough to have a country park just over the way, literally just over the road. And just get, okay, it's not the Serengeti with herds of wildebeest wandering around, but just getting out into that as the seasons change. It's cold, it's wet, or at the moment we're in springtime, everything's growing, everything's blooming. Huge. And for people with various sort of disorders, like I say, trying to get out into green things, or if you're near the coast, which is I'm not near the coast, personal favourite of mine is getting out and watching the sea. If you can combine those, I think from a mental health point of view and ipso facto a physical point of view, you're doing yourself a huge, huge favour. Now, spiritual health, I'm not what you would call traditionally religious. I suppose if I was anything, I would probably describe myself as a pagan. Not that I have it running around the garden naked on the full moon or anything, but I'm very much a believer in the power of nature. But this is a famous picture of the death of Socrates. And just delving back to some of these guys and some of the thoughts that were actually going around. You know, the ancient Greeks were tremendous people. Again, don't take everything at face value. The humours that they spoke about and the bloodletting and everything else is perhaps not such a good idea. Although, from what we spoke about, the Parabiosis, the bloodletting seems to be coming back into vogue again. But just looking back, seeing what history can actually teach us. And over and above that, if you believe in a God of whatever type or creed, then I use that. Belief can be a tremendous thing. And again, it can give us a really good mindset to actually move stuff forward. So use all of these. And finally, this is a point that if any of you are tuning in from abroad, I'm not quite sure how Goldilocks translates to outside of the UK. But very long story short, Goldilocks broke into the three bears' cottage and found 3 bowls of porridge on the table. And being hungry, she thought, great. The first one she tried was too cold for her. It was, oh, no, can't touch that. The second one was too hot, and they're going, oh, no, can't touch that. The third one was just right, and that's the one that she's got a mush in at the moment. So, and this, to an extent, has an effect on so many things. On what we're looking at here, you're going to come across things that are too hot or too cold, and somewhere in the middle is something that's just right. So finding that just right is obviously going to be the trick. And again, it's a different way of actually putting out there Ian's shades of grey. Is the porridge too hot for us? Is it too cold for us? But again, it's that word again. But things tend to be more nuanced. You are going to get outliers who don't want the medium bowl of porridge. They're going to want and absolutely thrive on the cold bowl of porridge or the hot bowl of porridge. So you need, whether we're talking athletes or whether we're talking non-athletes, you need to know your client, because that person may be one of these outliers. We've all seen research on carbohydrate feeding as opposed to fat feeding and endurance work. And on the whole, carbohydrate feeding will give you a better endurance results. But I remember seeing, again, it was one of Ian's very early graphs that I saw. And it was a scatter graph. And there were a couple who showed that, again, they absolutely thrived on their long distance bike ride and being fed fats. So we can never take anything for granted. Always delve slightly more in detail into the research that you're looking at and how that equates to the clients that you're looking at. So that is me. I just want to, I had a question. I'm very nearly there, Ian. I'm just on the last second. I had a question crop up on what I had actually changed during the course of my career. And yes, I have changed things. I'm doing things very much the same as I said before. I'm still training. I'm still eating with a huge amount of precision. But my training has changed. I'm now looking at more of the things that I spoke about on the movement patterns. I hadn't run for 20 years. I'm now much more into that sort of movement because I know it's the old thing, use it or lose it. My diet has changed and I'm experimenting with, again, things that we've spoken about. Do I need more protein because I'm getting older? But is that more protein doing me harm through these various mTOR channels? And you learn huge lessons in life. I am of the age where I've seen my parents grow old, unfortunately get sick and die. Okay, mum was well into her 90s, so damn good innings and all that. But I've seen these things happen. I can equate them. Her sister is still alive, well into her 90s. And she has done so much with regards to social interconnection that my mum didn't do. So we really need to look at the people around us, how it's being affected. So have I changed things? Absolutely, I've changed things. And I will continue to change things. This is an ever-evolving subject, which makes it so fascinating, so complex, and so interesting. I thank you all for your time. I hope that a lot of that made some sort of sense. As when I first started off, there's going to be more questions than there are going to be answers. But at the very least, if I've got all of you or any of you just thinking about various aspects of what I've spoken about, and this leads you into looking up your own research, diving into Google. If you want to speak to me about anything whatsoever, please do so. Please come back to me. I'm on various social media or via Ian. So if I've had you thinking about it and doing your own research, looking into how this is going to affect you, how this is going to affect your loved ones, how this is going to affect your clients, both athletes and non-athletes, then I've done halfway a job. If I've entertained you halfway while doing it, then I will consider that a job very well done. So, as I say, thank you very much indeed. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please give me and Ian some feedback on this. I would love to hear from you. And until the next time, God bless.